Okay. Hi, Sarah.
Hey,
So
Gwyneth.
I will start with asking you just to tell me a little bit about who you are and what work you're doing at the moment.
So hard to define who I am and what I do. I would say more of I'm a systems navigator and weaver, and I also maybe relate to more as a design strategist, but more coming from a regenerative lens. But on many levels, I would say I would weave all these experiences and working with whole systems design, regenerative developments, um, healing work, and working on I guess a transition from um, a degenerative experience and realities into a more regenerative experience for many communities in transition, especially in climate vulnerable nations in the global south. And um, so, yeah, I'm in the Philippines, and I founded a nonprofit called Green Relief Initiative. At first, it wasn't meant to be a nonprofit. That's why the name is not really that sounding like a nonprofit. But the idea was to how do we respond to the challenges of climate change without the same factors that caused it in the first place. And so with that, we work with regenerative approaches like permaculture and ecovillage design. But on many levels, I'm also an art therapist. I work with expressive arts therapy as well. I support my work with well-being and therapeutic approaches. For example, when we work with gardens, with permaculture gardens and communities after disasters and displacement, there's also the aspect of the psychosocial mental health dimension of working with gardens for healing. So on another level, I work with ecotherapy and working with the handles that work with climate psychology and how do we kind of work with that grief, and the grief process and working with trauma and then how do we find our wholeness and resilience in the process. But on many levels, yeah, I would say I play around with different hats. I work with expressive arts in well-being and working with. I also work with ritual and community ceremonies. I'm also a kind of a narrative strategist or and a design strategist, and then I would say on the other side, I'm also a consultant. So I wear many hats, but overall, the space I hold is the I guess the regenerative transition from resilience to regeneration, from survivor to thriver, and from healing to wholeness on many levels in my work. So yeah, I don't know how to capture that well, but hopefully that gives a little bit of overview of the complexity of the role.
Absolutely. And I think all the people that I've interviewed wear many hats, and we have to these days, right? Because
Yeah.
things are complex and they need complex solutions. So, to try and simplify it a little bit, can you tell me a bit more then about the Green Relief initiative that you founded? So, I was intrigued how you were mentioning like rewriting the narrative, right, of disaster risk reduction into design for resilience and regeneration. So, can you tell me a little bit more about kind of what that means and what you're doing?
Yeah, so Green Relief, as a Filipino, which is one of the climate vulnerable nations in the world, we face almost around 20 typhoons a year. So, um, and that's only one hazard that we have to deal with. But where Green Relief was founded, and the idea that to to transition into the new story and how do we support that, yeah, like without the same factors that cause the climate change in the first place. So many of our solutions are nature based. It's also supporting the community to redesign their system into a more holistic approach, working with traditional ecological knowledge and indigenous wisdom, and then also with regenerative approaches like permaculture and regenerative and ecovillage design, but anchored on the local context and experience and the language. Um, yeah, a lot of it have started it on many levels, coming from an experience with, how aid has often been, short term in thinking. So you have relief packs that are often like packed with plastics and all these things. So we have, how do we do a living assistance with vegetables and gardens in camps and resettlements? How do we support with earth-based, ecotherapy for communities that need to recover from their traumatic experience? Um, and that became more of, how we started. And then the shift of the narrative from DRR, which is often the approach to reducing reduction risk, which is necessary. I'm not saying it's not important, but it also comes from a lens where you're only coming from mitigating the minimum, so just to reduce the risk, but just because the risk is always there. But we do know that there are risks. We do know that there are, the increase of temperatures is just doesn't go lower. But if we design from that perspective that we only like just to meet the minimum to reduce, but what if we go beyond that and actually think in advance, think in ahead, think beyond this generation, even, like indigenous elders who think of 7 generations, that is more long term, and not just think about how to reduce it, but how to even overspill, just um how do we why did I say overspill? Because reducing is more of like reducing the risk, but overspill in terms of like how do you take out the risk in the first place and make steps towards taking that out. So it's the terminology, and also it's the shift from aid to sovereignty, to the shift from security to, a more regenerative lens, from sustainability to regenerative. It's the shift from resilience, which is also in a way a survivor, mode. Survivor is the first step, to help people come into that, from victims and to survivors, and to help them find the resilience, the capacity to remember and restore what they already have in their place. But we need to go beyond just the survivor mode, but how do we help people thrive? And thriving is a different experience where you still go through the risk and then the challenges, but you're able to kind of come back really fast, and you're not just limited by just what you only need to always recover, but you're already kind of have the enabling ecosystem to easily come back from that challenge. So from that space is the shift from resilience to regeneration, the shift from survivor to thriver. And so regeneration is where like the ecosystem can actually meet the shocks. It's strong enough to adapt quickly. It's able to support challenges that happen and recover really faster than if you were in resilience and survivor mode. So there are many levels to that, and it has to do with also the shift from restoring the what we have lost, and reclaiming that, into restoring. So we change the story and change the narrative. We don't try to design the solutions from the old way we thought, which caused the problem in the first place. So yeah, in many ways that's how that's how I'm working now. And yeah, so Green Relief is one space that I work with. I work also with the Global Ecovillage Oceania and Asia, where it's also a network of ecovillage projects, permaculture work around the region in Asia and the Pacific. And we also try to find a way where that restoring can come from decolonizing the narratives what regeneration or development is. And many of us in the global south come from that historical, standard of development and measure that has been in the first place was founded on a Western ideal and measure, and also actually sadly sourced from the raw materials and the natural resources of the global south. So when you go to Europe, you have all these amazing grand, wooden structures and all these amazing grand. Why do I repeat that? It's just
Yeah,
this that have been built
castles
and
and
it was
trees.
built on slavery or colonization and lots of the forests from our forests, and so and then to expect us to meet the GDP or the standards of development and call us underdeveloped, and to meet the standards that they have set, that they have walked ahead and the resources taken, and then now we are also the most climate vulnerable. And so it's just it's many layers of that. And I'm not coming from this, try to kind of I'm coming from how do we heal that story, and how do we acknowledge and work with that grief, that anger, that hurt, but also how by in a restoring process. And the same with the land, we work with the ecosystem. Many of the agricultural systems that we've inherited are also coming from a more colonized approach of working with pesticides and agro-industrialization and this.
And monoculture, right? Like,
Yeah, yeah. And how do we restore that, the local knowing, and the soil, and how to detox that. And it would take 5 years for minimum for soil that has absorbed so much glyphosate and a lot of pesticides to detox. And how do we now also restore, like how do we reclaim and re-indigenize? So from decolonizing that restores to re-indigenizing that restores the way we see ourselves, our identities, and the way we define what is change. Just today we were trying to strategize how do we highlight the knowing of the Asian culture and the Pacific culture on development and regeneration. Because, like, for example, if you go to Bhutan, you have the gross national happiness as a way to measure countries' economic or other development standards. They are also the net zero, a country that has zero, has trying to meet zero carbon by offsetting that. And they're if you go to Thailand and the Buddhist countries and nations, they have their own economic model that's founded on compassion. And if you go to the Pacific Islands, and you have the popular circular economy right now, but there's also the, like, how do the Maori people perceive a circular economy from an indigenous worldview? It's not just the Maoris, you have a lot of indigenous communities here that already have a whole system approach to things. And so for us, we're trying to see as how do we shape and acknowledge these knowing and wisdom, which the wisdom is more of the application of knowing that has been practiced over time, and it's really just embodied. It's already lived and tested. It's not something you ideate and implement and test and prove. But that restoring process is joined in my work. The shift from survivor to thriver, the shift from resilience to regeneration. And this is also where we the shift from decolonizing to re-indigenizing, and then in the process uh, you know um, I guess move us forward from a more reductionist DRR lens, but into a more holistic and I guess the opposite of produce is to over spill, or to give, right? And so in a life-giving lens of regeneration, that seems to be the journey that I'm navigating on, weaving with, shaping with others. And that's, I guess, part of also a personal life story in a way. So that's very foundational in what I do. So So yeah, that's like kind of a big explanation there, but hopefully it kind of gives a little frame of the journey so far and how it went.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it makes me think of so many of the models of how we do things in the West, right? Like medicine, it's so much more about, oh, let's create drugs to fix problems instead of let's look at how to be healthy and thriving in the first place so you don't need the medicine, right? And that's kind of what I think you're saying, not just let's put a band-aid on the wound, but let's look at why it's happening to begin with. And what I wanted to ask too, because I've been talking to a lot of people recently about healing and decolonization, but what's on my mind is that this isn't just a thing that happened in the past, right? Like exploitation and extraction is still ongoing now, even if people like to live in a world where, oh, that's just something that happened in the past, but it's obviously happening today, maybe on a wider scale than it ever was. So yeah, how do you go about changing the narrative, healing the trauma when it's actually still happening?
Yeah, well, it when we hold space for grief, it's really, it has to be a safe space, right? So I would recognize your work in healing yourself. You would recognize this when someone is grieving and someone is hurt or angry, rather than hold them back, is to create a safe space. Of course, I'm not an expert at this because sometimes I get triggered as well for like difficult experiences, and also very strong personalities, but it's also a learning process. Everything is a learning, and I think a lot of it is to do with unlearning too. We're trying to unlearn the process of how we were all conditioned. So it's not even just the colonized nations, but also um, not necessarily the colonizer nations. I don't know what exactly is the right term, but the countries that have that history, but also part of us too, the formerly colonized nations, to also unlearn in the process, because it's also our journey to reclaim ourselves, reclaim our identities, our seeds, reclaim our land. So there's that process, but it does require a safe space, because as you know, in grief work, sometimes it shows up in the middle of something, it shows up in the past, but a right way is, in my past too, I've worked with peace building and worked with the peace process in my country. And um, for countries or nations, like the formerly colonized nations, there are a process called with Truth and Reconciliation Commission established, because there needs to be a way to also recognize that something was done. And I guess as humans in general, we can move on only when that hurt was recognized, acknowledged, if not from the perpetrator, but by ourselves. That when we recognize that something did happen to us, and then we can now acknowledge that. It does take a really very safe process, held by the right enabling conditions. Um, it doesn't happen overnight. It needs a safe dialogue space. Dialogue is one way. There's a practice called Theory Anew, right? And it's also about going deep into the different levels of listening, and where generative dialogue at the bottom of that U is where you're now going beyond the existing now, where you're all both just not entirely in the same space yet exactly, but you're able to see like what is beyond you now. And but to get there, it requires some navigating and weaving and sense making, and a lot of healing work really. And um I don't know if that helps a little bit. Recognizing, accepting, acknowledging, honoring, these are some ways we can go through the grief process. And then at some point there's also a sense of returning, of reclaim, returning, like returning the land, or helping people tell their own story as well. So like in our work, we work sometimes with indigenous communities, and we're trying to prototype a way where using media like art and photography and film is that they get to tell their own story. They get to document their own medicinal and edible plants, because I read somewhere it's about narrative sovereignty, where it's the the people who lost their land um, uh, could lead that restoration and reclaiming of that land and their identities along with it. So um, and that's where I weave the arts in my work, and because the arts is very universal, it's not, although of course as much as you can also localize it, but it's the local art form that an expression of that. But it's also universal in such a way that we're trying to also bridge language, because language, of course, can also be dominating, right? And I was just speaking to someone today about, they were saying like the Philippines, you guys have a lot of great projects, amazing work, and compared to the rest of the Asians. But I was also saying that we're an English-speaking nation. We were colonized by the U.S. for many years, and it doesn't mean that even if our stories are there, that's not good things happening in Thailand or Myanmar and other countries just because their language. It's because their language is not easily understood. So, so being able to help, in that reclamation is a really important process, and that invites us to holders of that process to step back. Just how do you're only a space holder creating that space. You're sharing the tools, but then who gets to tell the story is a big thing. Who gets to shape the narrative is also a big thing, because um, there is good about, we want to acknowledge and tell the story and help shape the new narrative, but it also has more transformative power if we allow the people in that journey to share the stories themselves.
Yeah, it's a very important point, right? Because, for example, for this, I can only really talk to people in English, and it's going to limit what I find out about. So I'm just thinking now how to widen that. I really was interested with what you have in your LinkedIn profile, saying that you talk to indigenous shamans and elders, but also to government and business. So I'd love to hear about how these different worlds kind of, combine in your life.
Yeah, that's so interesting, because today I'm recalling this story of our former president passed away today, and he was the president that was instrumental for the signing of the peace agreement between the government and some rebels that I was part of. I was helping in the peace consultation. But in the process, as an artist and working in healing, I was also able to kind of encourage to create a ceremony and a ritual for the resumption of the peace talks and for the signing of the peace agreement. Because it was inspired by the indigenous elders I studied with and learned from, that the traditional way of peace building in my culture has to do with, acknowledging the hurts, coming into a circle. It's not about just signing a piece of paper and just but it's also creating that space where we meet eye to eye in a circle. We're not like someone is above and below or higher. So in yeah, my experience with that has been, to be honest, was not like I set out to do it. I was brought out to it. I ended up in this world and invited in this world of process, I and then eventually now I'm also like, I guess actively pursuing it more, because I'm so grateful from this experience. It's important because we have so much to learn from indigenous peoples. They are holders of a lot of wisdom. And I'm not saying it just from the parts of the world where we have tribes, but it's also about indigenous knowing. What is our knowing of being connected to the earth? So I would also say that to the nations that are the global north, I guess, the you have your own indigenous First Nations wisdom too, from your Celtic traditions, and at least in your traditions where you come from. And so it's also about remembering that. And so yeah, in my work here, I kind of jumped there, sorry, but in my work here, that comes naturally. So if whether it was in those supporting the peace talks in my country, or that in the after in a disaster area, we were invited to support an indigenous village recovering from the typhoons, which we eventually found out that it was not just the typhoons that was challenging, but also a rapid deforestation and cutting down of old coffee trees and other biodiversity to grow GMO corn. And so what we did was just to show and demonstrate, alternatives to it, to using permaculture and weaving the traditional knowledge of the place, but also create a space where engaging the government to dialogue and create a plan with the community for a more agroecological approach. We couldn't finish that because of COVID, but we're now elevating it and transitioning it to a bigger council to lead it for us. But we're helping to support on this side. But that process of creating dialogues and learning from them has been, I guess I would symbolize it with, I was sharing one time in an event. The In the Philippines, the word for leadership is pamumuno, and pamumuno is the root word is tree. And so when we think of a tree as a tree, and in a worldview of an indigenous worldview that is rooted in earth wisdom and deep knowing of our relationships with the earth, that's the kind of leadership and governance we hope to that shows up, I guess, in the spaces that I help create and co-create with these communities. Lastly, there, for some reason, there's the elements of working with the unseen in this work. That they recognizing that they're part of the process of the dialogues and planning. So in this same village, when we were invited, it was only when we did the planning with the government for their village that showed up. What showed up was apparently the land that was granted to us to help to demonstrate regenerative practices was apparently the land that their ancestors donated to the school to become that place. And so we had no idea about this before. And so it was just like, it was just acknowledging that something is at work that works around that space. So for me, yeah, that it has been a truly special and still continues to be a special journey. We're about to work with another indigenous community in the South, where there are dream weavers, dream weavers that they channel with their weaving designs from dreams, but they're also like at risk of losing their biodiversity, and they're starting to depend on no longer depend on their land for food. So we're also supporting that process of helping support indigenous food systems at that place. So yeah, I continue. It's just an ongoing journey, and just we trust whoever invites us is always a new experience, but still a deep old experience and wisdom to draw from. So sorry about the cat.
Oh, don't worry. There's always life happening in the background,
Yeah.
I wanted to share with you. Yeah, I'm Welsh, and I'm trying to learn more about also the Celtic traditions, and the Druids, who were the spiritual leaders many years ago. The word in Welsh for Druid is derwydd, and the word for oak is derw. So yeah,
that's beautiful.
So
what is it? Can you repeat that?
Yeah, it's derwydd is a druid, and derw is an oak. And there's some Welsh is a beautiful language that I also have the honor of speaking and teaching to some people. So yeah, so that when you mentioned about the leaders and the word for tree, it seems to be it's a universal thing, maybe in the psyche somewhere, right?
Hmm.
So,
Yeah.
okay, I'd like to end by just asking you, what is your vision for the future that keeps you motivated to do this work?
Hmm. This is, I guess, probably this is the first. I've come from a 7-year journey of trying to make sense of my experience. And this year I've been committed to like kind of start telling my story, even if it's very strange. But because over the years I've been able to prove that it is actually true. And so I would trust that this is a safe space to share it. But my vision of the future, because since I was young, I would dream of disasters ahead of time. So probably this is why I'm on this path. Um, and also at the same time, I get to interact with visions of the next generation. And um, I see, children ahead of time, and sometimes I meet them in person. And gosh, this is the first time I'm sharing this to the public. I do just privately share this to people. Uh, but I would trust it because it's been continuous, and I also see the children in person after. So I think my trust is the message is that no matter how much destruction we're facing, there's that new narrative from the next generation that is setting things ahead of us. And you can see that in Greta Thunberg and the young people, young people that I work with, like a colleague of mine who's, Kisha, who's also working with in restoring our marine ecosystems and terrestrial ecosystems. There are younger groups in the Philippines that are just, working also in disasters. There's a group called Kids for Kids. And so it's just amazing that even if we're all stuck in the adult fear and just like, how do we do this, we messed up this earth. But there's that future generation that's already like, they're the ones driving, this should be it. Like, where are you driving us? Where are you leading us? You should be ashamed of yourselves, them telling us this. So how do we, so I guess the future that I would see is ways that we could really change the narrative. But it comes from, I guess, a symbol of also of childhood is to come from a new way of seeing, not coming from, it's really helping us, break down our old way of thinking and seeing. So it's inviting us to see from that space. And I don't know, I don't have a structured process, but I guess it's always the shaping of the new narratives together. So we can only see that as we create that in the process, as we heal the past, and then you try to presence in the future, in the present, and then trust the emerging future and shape that together. So that's also the future narrative that I'm seeing where I'm from. So yeah, I just I'm also careful I shared something that's so private for me, and but hopefully this is held in a, a lot of people are seers and dreamers anyway, so I don't think I'm alone in this practice. I guess a part of me feels like if I share this publicly, I would stop seeing these visions, but it doesn't matter. The message is there. I maybe the purpose of sharing that was just meant to inspire me in my work, and hopefully it inspires others, and it creates more impact with some level of higher non intangible support system, I guess. So yeah, I'm gonna stop talking because I feel like I'm gonna speak
No,
more
I think
as I go. Yeah, so
it
yeah.
will hopefully, help other seers to step out of the shadows, because there's like a fear and shame about admitting that maybe we're, receiving messages from somewhere, right? Because it sounds crazy and it doesn't work with the dominant narrative where humans have no connection to anything.
It's
And
true. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, I think that's part of my fear.
Mhm.
But it's also the same intuition. I guess if we just call it intuition, really, it's just an inner knowing and being more connected to a deeper guidance. All of us have that. We're not just human physical bodies, right? So we are also in tune with the wisdom that's bigger than what we know now. So I trust that, yeah, it's safe enough to share that. Yeah, hopefully that's helpful. I didn't anticipate that question, so I didn't really know how to answer that. That's the only answer I know my whole life. So hopefully that's helpful anyway. So
That's right. I do throw that question at people at the end because that's usually, it's just very interesting that we're all moving to something, we're driven, and yet when you ask people what's the vision at the end, most people don't have it very clearly, right? And yet I guess we have to have some vague, blurry version of the future we want, even if we don't have, like the spreadsheets and the measurable points, because that's very old paradigm maybe. But anyway, thank you so much, and thank you for sharing that as
thank you so
well.
much.
And
Yeah, I'm glad we got to share this in a short way. In a nutshell, I kind of like shared with you a whole universe in a nutshell, but this is also a good exercise for me to articulate. I'm not used to writing so much, so articulating is better for me. It helps me make sense of this is exactly what I do. It's so hard to define that. So thank you. I appreciate this.
oh, you're welcome.
Yeah, and I love the story of the druids and the oak, and just looking forward to discovering more about your work and learning with you in the process. We're creating this space called Story Dialogues between the global north or south or east west, the dominant narratives and unheard narratives, and find ways to look at ways of decolonizing, re-indigenizing, and new narratives that come from it. Maybe we can invite you as well in the process, and even share the druid story and just come from there. The wisdom of your place, and also the knowing and the knowledge that you have in healing work and working with climate change and psychology. And I think it's powerful that we interacted together today. So I will trust that this is the beginning of something that we